Hey SpaceWatchers, this is Space Café Radio, your channel about trends, awesome events and interesting people in the space sector. This Space Café Radio is very special. It is the first episode of a space law mini-series recorded live in Bremen at the Space Tech Expo on 22nd of November 2024. This episode is the first block of 3 in that workshop organized by Professor Leslie Jane Smith and Dr. Ingo Baumann. In this episode, you will hear from Frank Germes, ESA, Dr. Oliver Heinrich, BHO, Dr. Bianca Linz from the Office of Communication in Liechtenstein, and from Dr. Dimitra Stefudi from the International Institute of Air and Space Law at the Leiden University. I'm Thorsten Grüning, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, and I had the honor to moderate through the event. Sit back and enjoy the world of space law. I would like to ask my first panel, that's Frank Germes, Dr. Oliver Heinrich, Bianca Linz, and Dimitra Stefudi. We will explore the vital interplay between procurement and national space law, a foundation for fostering innovation and setting the tone for a robust space industry. And each speaker will present 10 minutes, followed by an engaging panel discussion. Frank, you will start first. He will provide an insight into innovative procurement strategies as ESA and how they drive innovation in the space sector.
Hello, everyone. I'm Frank Germes, Head of Contracts in ESA. First of all, thanks a lot to Leslie Jane and Ingo. I must say it's very stimulating for someone which is participating to meetings with 20 people, 18 engineers, and the counterpart of contract where you may have a slot of 10 minutes to discuss about the contract. So there is a forum where we listen to each other, we can share our pain and our difficulties, but at least it's good. Head of contract, we used to be called head of procurement, and then we'll explain you why. That's the purpose of this presentation. So, this is something which is not new for many people working in ESA, but I think it's important to dwell on it. We are a procurement agency, but not only, of course, with some technical scientific expertise. We really bother a lot of our companies because we go into detail of the technical issues. But in all the domain of space, even more than NASA, we also do Earth observation, etc. It's not to compete by far, but we really cover all the kind of activities. And procurement in that respect is there to deliver. We have to achieve space mission when we have a lot of money from the taxpayers, and we have to be sure this is well spent and on time and on schedule, on time and on cost. We have, and we are quite proud of it, even if it's challenged. The geo-return implies that you need to give to the member state a return on investment. Geo-return is very important to federate money, otherwise we would have much less program than what we have today. We are there, and this is where we are sometimes a bit schizophrenic in contract, because to secure competitiveness of industry, so when we negotiate on one hand, we want to have a good value for money, so we try to negotiate the price down, but we don't do washing machine or bread. There are a lot of difficulties in the program we do, and we have to acknowledge the difficulties when there is hardship, and we should be a fair customer, especially because we want space industry to be robust, make profit, not only with us, to the export. But this is really an important element of the DNA of ESA. We are an innovation agency. You can see below in yellow, we have about 1,500 contracts per year to spend about between 5 and 7 billion of euro. 98% of these contracts are less than 2 million, spending half of the budget. And there is about 20 projects which spend the rest of the budget. So you can really see we have 2 different, activities of procurement, very wide spectrum, but we need to see how we can have that range. So traditional procurement methods we have in ESA, I think all procurement lawyers will recognize that. Just like the commission or like many public organizations, open competition is the baseline. So we should be saying we go open competitive unless there is a reason not to do restricted competition. We do that often in general procurement, so not for space activities, because you have so many companies that you can have so many offers. So you make a first filtering about the companies that are credible on the market. Classified, when we deal with security, classified info like Galileo or so. Two stage. I don't go into detail. We have multi-supplier framework contract. We have quite a good toolbox of classical activities. We can go non-competitive also if it's well justified. IPR, continuity of previous work. Framework, two-stage tendering. We have this competitive dialogue. We have been practicing it a lot with the European Commission on Galileo to start with. Because the traditional way to do competitive dialogue in ESA is the parallel phase AB1, which is much more focused on the technical solution, but keeping competition. And also because we want to secure that we have competition, let's say at all levels, to be sure also that every member state get their share of the cake, if I may say at least in terms of industry. We organize it when a prime has been selected with the core team, that the competition is also organized at equipment or subsystem level. So if you take a big mission, you can have, after the prime has been selected, 50, 60, 100 individual competitive ITT to run that. That's the classical regime of ESA, and we have moved in recent years also in cases where we go with a full consortium, meaning we get a full industrial team from the start in the offer. So that's the business as usual as procurement in ESA, let's say, that we do for several decades. So you've seen in the Agenda 2025 of Joseph Aschbacher, in the Space Summit, in the many declarations, we speak about adapting the procurement tool to the new space environment. And spoke about commercialization, but there is a lot of activities done with new space, and we need to be not too bureaucratic and to adapt us in that respect. But first, what we already have implemented for more than 20 years now with co-funded program, we started with the telecom area where we had really a down period in the 90s where we were just doing a little bit R&D. It was very much commercial and the operators were thinking, oh, ESA is too bureaucratic. They are not going to help us there. So we tried to find a way to help them. And we created program like CARTES. We extended on GSTP. We had the technology transfer program where we have implemented call for proposal, which was for all activities at industry activity and industry initiative from 10,000 euros to 700 million. If you take Neosat or Electra, a certain number of programs like that are real PPPs. The PPPs in ESA are not the PPPs on the commercial market. Ingo would know that much more than me, but it's not like a classical concession contract where the private investment is done and then the income only comes later. Of course, this can work like that, but ESA doesn't want to take a share in the market risk. We support the technology development, the development phase, but not so much the market. At least that's the baseline. We have some exception. I think we'll address that with Oliver on when we could be an anchor customer. We have some example in the past. We have a few coming up, but that's an example. Before we were doing, I would say, a bit of cosmetic using the existing procurement regulations to be able to adapt with this call for proposal for something where at the end we are not a customer. And now there's a big change of the procurement regulation. We call them contracting regulations. I don't know the formal expression in English, but we as lawyers would like to have, a contract which is adapted to the particular purpose. But because it was procurement, because we were supposed to be a customer, we played a little bit, insisting on deliveries, insisting on license on all IPR, a certain number of elements like that. So let's say on ESA Star News, the detailed text of the contracting regulation offline. I'll go pretty quick because I think we don't have so much time, but just this one is to illustrate the flow of activities. I did come from industry. We look at it to see whether this is within the objective and the boundary conditions for a given program. We have in parallel contact with the national delegations to see whether they are ready to finance it. It's co-finance, and then we go into full proposal and to place a contract. That's basically the scheme. There's a lot of effort to be done there because the interaction with the member state can be very long, much too long. And this is really one of the big problems we have on time to contract. Depending on the country, it can be very quick or it can be pretty long. So new contracting regulation in just a couple of words. First, we have simplified a lot. If I tell you the number of article, number of annex, it doesn't say too much, but we had 300 pages. We are now with a formal regulation, which is 100 pages. In that respect, we also, and those of you which are submitting proposal to ESA, you have the general conditions of tender, you have the special one, you need to look at one and the other. We will have one single document to cover that. We changed a bit the review procedure, not so much on the governance, the way, the independency, because we are really confident this is a very good scheme in terms of independency and also in terms of scope, which is limited to procedural breach, not to the substance of the issue. But we have faced, I would say, in the last 6 months, several cases where we are still using registered mail. And we know, all of us as a citizen, how prehistorical registered mail has become. And as lawyers, we know we can also see having some certified digital way to communicate. So we make that move, and it's look like a detail, but I can tell you it can ease our life very much. Flexibility. So we have those working with the European Commission, they have what they call a vademecum, which is an internal document, a user manual for the operators. They have, let's say, an internal guideline design document which would allow to adapt the rules depending on the context, but remaining strictly compliant with the regulation. And then we introduce new contracting tools. One is a contest, is anecdotic in a way, but we missed that and it was still something we can use. And mainly the call for proposal without procurement and cooperative agreement. I will not go into the detail of that. We have really been ruling a lot the practice we had, but we go one step further on here. Again, I don't go into detail, don't worry, Torsten. But here is typically, we do not have technical requirement to specify. So we do not have that element. It means we do not have acceptance procedure on something we don't ask. We don't need deliveries in most of the case. So from the start of the contract, you can already know that we are not going to deliver a platform of a satellite or very complex software or so. You can team up with an operator, which can be your customer. So we are much more explicit in making it as a partnership and not as a customer-supplier relation. So I don't go into the detail there. You can really go on ISASTAR News. You have both the regulation. We will make a webinar on the 3rd of December where we go much more in detail about the commonalities. If you distribute a slide after that, I have some backup slide to identify the main differences, commonalities and differences with the existing contract that we have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you for the honor to say, really a burning question. If I sign with ESA a first cooperative agreement, what do I do with my subcontractors? Do they get the same? Do they get a normal model subcontract? What is your perspective on that? Because I was asked on it and I had no answer.
The answer is a typical lawyer's one. It depends. Now, more seriously, if you take a PPP where you want to, let's say, to make an in-orbit servicing contract, where you develop as a prime the platform, where you are going to co-fund, you're the one to use that as a provider to an operator, the cooperation is with you. We say to you, we don't want to get the platform delivered, find a customer to get it, but then the subcontractor that are going to help you to perform this platform, to develop this platform, actually you place a procurement contract with them. You want them to deliver to you. So it may depend, of course, you may have some partnership at the lower level. I don't figure it out as a MFSC like this, but I would normally say that in your case as a prime contractor, because you're the one that want to develop a business out of it, yes, you go with a procurement contract with your suppliers. If you have a partner that can also, it can even be an operator, even a co-prime situation, then you can also have a cooperative agreement. But if it's really to help you to build something, then you procure, and then it's a procurement contract.
So it is up to me. Our subcontractor can not really ask for, I also want to have a cooperative agreement. It's my decision.
Yeah, and it's also, for instance, it may depend on the co-funding rules. At ESA, what is important is that is a co-funding according to the rules at the, let's say, 50-50 between you and ESA. You can have subcontractors which are paid 100%. You can have others that also have a real business to develop on particular product. And you also put, I would not say cooperative agreement because you still want them to deliver something to you. And ourselves, when we are an anchor customer, then it's not a cooperative agreement because if we are a customer in one way, even if 90% of the business will be for commercial market, because we want to get something delivered, then we follow the procurement rules.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frank. Okay, next one, Dr. Oliver Heinrich from BHO Legal. Oliver will discuss the critical role of the just mentioned anchor customer in nurturing the growth in the space industry. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Torsten. I'm really excited to give you, hopefully, an understanding when you walk out of the room, what the term anchor customer is about. And especially since we are many lawyers around here or people who work with the law, is it something that is legally possible within the applicable systems? I think that would be interesting for everyone to be aware of. By the way, I'm very happy to see, as I'm constantly saying in any trainings I give on procurement law, is constantly evolving. And as I see with ESA now, we again have something to work on our next edition for the handbook, right? This is going to be another exciting chapter about ESA procurement. So we're going to take a deep dive into that. I'm sure I'm going to get in contact with you, get some more insight. Anchor customer for the space industry. It is something that you have certainly heard about in recent years quite a bit. It's one of those buzzwords which are floating around. Everyone uses it. Many people and many industry persons in particular are using it a little bit for their advantage without really much substance behind it. They use it in a way that it supports their interests. There's nothing bad about that, obviously. But I think as a lawyer, I'm always interested of having a clear understanding of a terminology. I want to relate to what's behind it. So what's behind the term anchor customer? If you boil it down to the substance matter, it's always something that is supposed to support startups in particular. It's supposed to be something that is dynamic. dynamic, that supports innovative procurement, and that is really moving in a way of also being very much competitive. We all know that was one of the items that was putting a lot of effort in and being competitive. So we need to be dynamic, we need to be competitive, but we also need to be reliable, because an anchor customer puts reliability to your industry and to your industry endeavors. And that's really what we can understand, what we have a common understanding of the term anchor customer, is this typical valley of death. I think many of this graphic where there's a lot of development going on initially, years of development, lots of money, lots of public money going into a product that is then basically market ready. But the issue is it is not proven as such. It is something that is completely new. There is no heritage to it, especially when it comes to launches. There is no launcher heritage to it. So the market is very hesitant of picking it up and really becoming your regular customer. You're in a very difficult situation of really making money with all your upfront investment. And that's where the anchor customer then really steps in. The anchor customer is the one that provides the stability to you, but not only that, also provides this heritage, because there's this trust. Once you have a customer which is procuring from you in a very large numbers, you will be able to tell that to the outside world. And you will, for example, say, ESA is one of our customers, and this is apparently something who is trusted and has requirements for quality. And if that customer is buying a lot from us, then we can sell it to other customers throughout the world. So that's very interesting, especially for startups who don't have that much money in the back of their hands initially. But the thing is, with the full understanding and the definition of the term, even though it's being used by many important people and many decision makers, it is not a legally defined term, at least not in Europe. And so we're taking a step back, looking over the Atlantic towards the US. And there, find in the NASA procurement rules, in the Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, we find in the subpart, I'm not going to quote that to you, it's not actually anchor customer, but it's anchor tenancy. But it really boils down to the same concept. And there again, we have this concept of procuring in sufficient quantities. It's not just procuring once, it's supposed to be procuring for a prolonged period of time in sufficient quantities in order to make a product commercially viable. So you are covering your immediate needs, but the product itself then becomes known to the market and it's going to be bought, hopefully also by other customers in the long run. Now, and this is where I was saying the term is very often used by industries in a way to really support their immediate needs. Now, we are still spending public money here. And that's the thing. Public money is not being spent without regulatory means. And even in the US, some people might say the US are so free and they're so dynamic and they're doing so many things that is not possible for us. Even in the US, they are doing things by the book. They have a massive amount of rules which they have to follow, which is obviously enshrined into their policy. If you look into the national policy, there is this idea of becoming competitive. There is this idea of becoming well-known and becoming a leader in a certain area. And once they have this policy going, then they are flexible enough. And that's the thing where the dynamic comes in. They are flexible enough to adopt and to adjust the policy and the regulatory framework that's around it, making it possible to really try something new. And then we're suddenly having these success stories where everyone in Europe is very envious about. We have these success stories of Digital Global, GOI, space imaging, making billions on government contracts. And that helps them to really move ahead. And now they're becoming leaders. And this is not only in the Earth observation. We all know the famous story of SpaceX. And that was something that was completely new. And it's very nice that you can look it up online. There's a long document, I think over 150 pages, where they're explaining the history of how SpaceX really won all these competitions, how it stepped up layer by layer and now really became the leading launch service provider in the world. And that is something which didn't come overnight. It took many years and it took some daring from NASA side and from the industry side to really come up with a new contractual setup. And that contractual setup was not merely procuring, but it was really going in the direction of partnership. And they were saying, we don't want to be only buyers, we want to be partners. But there's another issue with partners. Partners are sharing risk. And that's something which is sometimes ignored, especially from the public side. I can tell you a number of examples where the public side was saying, yes, we want to do public-private partnership, which obviously carries the name of partnership with it. But at the end, it turns out, let's talk about risk sharing. Risk sharing is going to be on the industry side, right? Because they want to gain something, so they have to take the risk. No, that is exactly the point. The dynamic part of it means that everyone has to sit around the table and really discuss who is not only willing, but able to take the risk, which is going to be part of a project. Those are just the examples of the US. And if you go deeper and you can look it all up online, but if you condense it, what's about the success stories of the tenancy customers in the US, we're talking about multi-year contracts. We're talking about firm fixed price contracts for most of the time. But we are also talking about clear requirements of performance, and we're talking about clear mission requirements. So there is a level of control. The money is not just being thrown into a black hole and then being used up by the industry. They are under a strict level of control, and they're only getting paid when they achieve. And there are possibilities to terminate these contracts also. Very interesting to look at, a lot, I think, to learn from for every lawyer who is working outside the US. And this is obviously then taken up with Europe, within Europe, and Europe is trying to replicate it in a way. But in Europe, we all know that European Union is working under the common market, and the common market has very strict rules of the way that the competition is being affected. And this means that the procurement law plays a major role. We are not as flexible, I have to say that. We're not as flexible as the US, unfortunately, because we have this idea of competition law and budgetary law. But we as procurement lawyers, I think my colleague Jan is going to support that. The procurement law is not the issue most of the time. The procurement law has a number of possibilities, a number of instruments to make things happen. We have the possibility to have smaller companies participate in procurements. We are able to purchase in reliable quantities. That is something which is really part of the way that you draft the contracts. And if you look at the legal framework, allows these things. We have to be cautious not to cast in stone capacity requirements, which especially startups are not going to fulfill, because then we're contradicting ourselves. On the one hand, we want to support startups. On the other hand, we're putting up capacity requirements which are completely out of this world. Sorry to say that, but then suddenly we end up with a situation like an Iris Square. Suddenly you have only one competitor and everyone complains. Why is that so? I say it's because you are not working the capacity requirements in the way that you should work them in order to allow competition. This is just my take on that from the outside. Basically, just to wrap it up, we have even the tools. Some of you have heard Innovative Partnership is a tool where especially you can support the procurement of an innovative product over a period of time. And then you have breakup points where if things are not moving well, then you terminate the contract and then you decide where the IP goes and all these things. It's all there. It's a toolbox that we can use, but we need to use it and we need to move ahead. And sometimes we need to be prudent trying something new. And that's my take on that.
Great. Thank you, Oliver. Great. Next one here. We will hear from Bianca Linz from the Liechtenstein Office for Communication, and she will offer an overview of the Liechtenstein Space Act and its implication for space activities.
Thank you very much. Very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this commercial space law workshop. It's a great pleasure being here today and tell you a little bit about the Liechtenstein Space Act. Before I get started, a few words on who we are. The Office for Communications is the regulatory and supervisory authority for several sectors, as you can see, from electronic communications to the postal sector. And since 1st of January, we are also the competent authority for the space sector, which I have the pleasure to be leading. So, Liechtenstein and space. I know this is a word combination that usually brings a lot of surprise into the faces. I know we are not exactly known as a spacefaring nation, although we do have some experience in the sector going back actually to the Apollo 11 mission. But why the need for a space law? As some of you might know, we are the notifying administration for a satellite constellation where we did the frequency filing back in 2014 at the ITU. We are actually not going to be the launching state for the satellites, but this project was the initial starting point for our government to become aware of the need for a national legislation for the space sector, especially because we have ratified 2 of the 5 space treaties. In 1980, the Liability Convention, and in 1999, the Registration Convention. We do have already for many years the international obligation to register space objects for which we are considered to be the launching state. And of course, we can be held liable for any damages caused by our space objects. So as a government, of course, you want to have the possibility to be informed about such space activities and also to authorize and supervise such activities. But during the process of developing our Space Act, we also became aware of other aspects that make space quite interesting, actually the economical aspects space brings. Space today is no longer reserved for the big spacefaring nations, nor is it limited to some super rich billionaires who want to colonize distant planets or engage in space tourism. Space is now a new industry that is no longer operating in isolation, but is increasingly intertwined with the traditional economy. And with that in mind, we started drafting our Space Act. You see here the timeline. I won't go much into detail here, but there is a story some of you might already know. that I always like to tell that happened during the consultation process. So we have this 3 months of consultation for a draft law and received some quite interesting statements from stakeholders and also an email with some pictures from a suborbital rocket being prepared to get launched from S-Range in Sweden with the Liechtenstein flag on it. And we were like, okay, wow, we did not know about this. As it turned out then, it was not a Liechtenstein rocket or a Liechtenstein space object to be launched. It was a payload, an experiment that the rocket was carrying. But nevertheless, it proved very well the point why we need a national legislation for space activities. Let's have a look at our Space Act. Our Space Act covers the 7 key elements identified by UNUSA in April 2012, but also like UNUSA recommended, we also took some other elements under consideration, not necessarily specifics of Liechtenstein's needs, but I would say specifics of needs of our time. And I'd like to show you some of them. So the core element of the law is, of course, the introduction of a procedure for the authorization. Very straightforward, no big surprises here. So operators of space activities that fall within the scope of our law are obliged to obtain an authorization. If the space activity is limited to a payload, then of course a notification suffices and we don't need an authorization. The liability and insurance, then operators are of course also required to have an insurance for their space activity, but to foster innovation and also support especially startup companies or research facilities, we have the possibility to reduce or even waive the insurance, depending on the associated risk and also the public interest. Another point that I would like to highlight is the transfer of ownership. The transfer of ownership is something that you will find in many space laws, actually. But we have learned something in the satellite project and also from my experience in the financial market sector. We decided to add also not just the change of operator, but also the change of control of the operator. Because space activities are increasingly characterized by international interconnectedness and growing globalization of business operations and corporate relationships. And as country, we have, of course, a big interest in knowing the identity of the operator of a space activity for which we can be held liable and responsible. If there is a change in the operator, meaning changes in the capital participation, directly or indirectly, in respect of certain thresholds, these changes must be notified to us. The notification of the planned acquisition must be submitted before the acquisition is legally executed. This is something very common actually in the European banking law, and we considered this as equally important also for the space sector. Of course, always depending on certain thresholds. And the last aspect that I would like to point out concerns the safety and security. We all remember the Viasat-KZ attack right before the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, which not only caused the disruption of the abilities of the Ukraine armed forces to communicate, but also left a severe collateral damage in many European countries. And in fact, until then, cybersecurity has been for many years been overlooked or just simply been ignored. And we decided to also add some cybersecurity requirements. What we want to see is on a risk-based concept, which measures the operator has taken, for example, to protect against unauthorized access to critical functions, but also to protect against communication disruptions and deceptions, ground systems, operating technology, and also measures to manage supply chain risks, which could affect the cybersecurity of the space object. And this is actually something I'm very happy to see that it's getting more and more attention also in Europe on a European level. The NIS2 directive, for example, now also considers space as a critical sector and has now cybersecurity requirements for ground stations. I think it's fair to say that we are not a flag of convenience. So why choose Liechtenstein? I think space should be driven by values like fairness, democracy, sustainability, also responsibility. I know our Space Act is very comprehensive, but I also think it's balanced, fair, and it enables us to ensure the highest possible safety of space activities in respect of the prevention of personal injury, prevention of damage to property, but also the preservation of the long-term use of space, the prevention of space debris, but also to support forward-thinking initiatives with transparent, predictable legal framework, also to build trust and stability. Liechtenstein is highly business-friendly jurisdiction with a strong focus on economic liberalism and open market policies, providing an attractive environment for innovation and investment. We have, so to say, literally very short ways of communication, which allows us as an administration to work very swiftly and efficiently, and thus to implement space activities very quickly without unnecessary bureaucracy. And we certainly do offer legal clarity and certainty without any surprises. And therefore, we invite and warmly welcome responsible operators to join us shaping the future of space activities. Thank you very much.
Just a short question. Is there a special reason that you undersigned two special agreements, liability and the registration convention, and not the outer space treaty? Or is it just a question of ongoing procedure?
We're now discussing with the government to also ratify the Outer Space Treaty. But at the time in 1979, it was more the concern about the increasing space activities that we should also ratify the Liability Convention. And the Registration Convention was actually because we are a member of Eutelsat IGO. And Eutelsat IGO wanted to be part of the registration part of UNUSA, of the COPUS. And they needed a certain number of member states who have ratified. And that's why we ratified the Registration Convention, actually. But now the times has changed. We are discussing to also ratify the Outer Space Treaty. Yes. And actually, there is the declaration of principles for the space sector and on which the Outer Space Treaty is based. And actually, the Outer Space Treaty is already now reflected in our space law.
I have a question. You mentioned a transfer of ownership is regulated. You also mentioned that it's not just a transfer of operator. So I take it's not cumulative. There can be a change of operator and a change of owner, but there can also be no change in operator, but a change
of control.
So meaning the ownership. And that is also at the same level. You require that not just a notification is made to you, but you review the authorization, and then you will then decide whether, in view of this new ownership, whether there's a continuity in the license or not.
If there is a change of control in the operator, then we have to be notified about it, and we would assess if the requirements are still met. This concerns, of course, also like political and geopolitical interests. And if there would be non-compliance of the requirements, then we would raise a substantiated objection. And until this is solved, the transaction could not go through.
So that's the case where there's a new owner, but they're not changing the operator.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next one, we have Dimitra Stafudi from the Leiden University, and she will talk about the Dutch legal framework for space activity and its impact on industrial players.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy that I follow up from very interesting and very innovation and business-friendly regime like the Liechtenstein one appears to be, with a regime that is equally innovation and business-oriented. That is the Dutch regime. And if I may say so myself, I believe it's a reflection of the Dutch efficiency. The legal basis is the Space Activities Act, which entered into force in 2008. It describes the main obligations, both for the government authorizing and supervising activities, but also for the operators that fall under it. And some more provisions have been specified in subsequent decrees and orders that concern the registration and the licensing process. You can find all of this online. Even a quick Google search will lead you to all the steps you need to take to authorize your activities in the Netherlands. And you will also find the accompanying forms concerning the licensing application. The latest development was almost 10 years ago, the Unguided Satellites Decree that extended the application of the Space Activities Act to unguided satellites. A closer look to the Space Activities Act describes the activity, the national activity that every country should authorize and supervise under the Outer Space Treaty as the launch, the flight operation, and the guidance of an object. The launch is rather obvious, although it's unlikely to happen from the Netherlands. The flight operation and the guidance is the navigation and control of an object between the launch stage and its placement into orbit. That's the flight operation. And the guidance covers the operation of that object while in orbit until its disposal or perhaps re-entry. Its scope is rather territorial. It covers activities that happen in the Netherlands or from a Dutch aircraft or spaceship alone for the moment. But it may change in the future, perhaps to cover people of Dutch nationality that operate abroad. And overall, it describes licensing requirements that should be met by any applicant in order to receive permission to operate its activity in the Netherlands. The license concerns an activity, not an object as such, and most of them have to do with the technological, technical, and financial feasibility of that activity. Some of these provisions worth perhaps focusing on are the ones concerning insurance, which is of course mandatory third-party liability insurance, up to a maximum amount that is decided on a case-by-case basis depending on the activity, and that is set by the minister responsible for space activities in the Netherlands. Liability is also for the operator limited to the insured amount, but the state maintains the right to recourse depending on the damage that has been caused and on the amount that is being sought by the damaged party. The Act is also including provisions concerning the establishment of a national registry of space objects and for the procedure of registering space objects with the UN registry, and connecting to the business friendliness and the innovation-looking character of the Act that I mentioned earlier. For the moment, there is no application fee. If you have a look at the explanatory note of the Space Activities Act, you will see that there are some rather affordable administrative fees that are mentioned, and you can even find a calculation of working hours that a highly experienced professional would need to complete all the forms and all the steps that are needed to obtain a license, and the decision, positive or negative, has to be made within 6 months. Already, if you land into the page of the licensing authority in the Netherlands that I will mention in the next slide, you will see that everyone is invited to contact the authority and see how they can best navigate the regime in order to receive the authorization that they need. Anyone who is interested to get an activity authorized in the Netherlands has to go through an initial audit to obtain a license. The ministry that is in charge of the space sector in the Netherlands is the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Development, that has delegated the specific activity of authorizing space activities to the Digital Inspection Authority, the Rijksinspectie Digitale Infrastructuur, for those of you who may be familiar with the language, which consults also with external experts to test the technical and financial feasibility of a proposed activity. Those experts include Leiden University, that is checking the legal and insurance compliance, NLR, that is the Dutch Aerospace Center, that is mostly checking the technical compliance, and PwC, that is checking the financial and business plan of a proposed activity. For those who are obtaining a license and perform their activity, this license is valid for the duration of the activity, but there are intermediate audits every 2 to 3 years. And of course, on top of a license, as happens in most jurisdictions, an operator will need to seek frequency allocation, slot coordination with the state through the ITU. And if they operate a ground station, an earth station as this described in the regime, they should also seek a license for that. So far, the Netherlands has issued 5 licenses, the first one to SES and the subsequent ones to ISIS and TU Delft. SAT is the amateur radio communication satellite. It's mostly for experimental scientific purposes. And there has also been a license that was granted but was returned by the operator, that is Hyber, that launched the satellite but in the meantime faced troubles in their business and decided to stop and return the license to the state. If I can focus into 2 issues of particular interest stemming from the Dutch space framework. One has to do with unguided satellites. This reflects technological developments, technological and industrial developments. There have been efforts by a Dutch company that by now is very well known around the world, ISIS Space, to create, launch, procure small satellites, but also by TU Delft that launches mostly experimental satellites that are small unguided satellites. Initially, they were not foreseen by the Space Activities Act. However, the intention was to regulate these activities, first of all, to provide legal certainty, but also a framework for operation. And this is what prompted the adoption of the Unguided Satellites Decree in 2015, which on top of the launch, flight operation, and guidance of satellites, it also includes the control of these unguided satellites within its scope. This means that all the obligations to obtain a license and fulfill all those requirements are also valid for the operators of unguided satellites. And as far as insurance is concerned, of course, there is this obligation, but before this regime, each satellite would have to obtain insurance per item. Insuring a small satellite under the same terms as a regular satellite is not perhaps very convenient, very business friendly, but considering unguided satellites as one licensed activity means that you have to obtain insurance for a bunch of satellites as one activity. So the insurance requirement is a little more flexible. There is an estimation of how much that will cost. Of course, that estimation comes from 2016 and premiums in the meantime have changed. For an activity of insured 20 million, you will have to pay perhaps a premium of 20,000. That is just to give a benchmark indication of that, what the insurance requirement for a small satellite means. A particular element of the Dutch Space Act is the position of the Netherlands as a launching state. The liability convention tells us that it's the state that launches or procures the launching, state from whose territory or facility an object is launched. The latter is a little unlikely from the Netherlands, that is a very small country, and without, for the moment, territorial facilities to launch from. And from the Netherlands, this is interpreted as being the launching state only for the activities that are procured by the government, such as the military satellite, for example, that was launched a couple of years ago. For activities that are procured by private companies, several companies that operate in the Netherlands, there have to be bilateral agreements between the states involved in this activity to indicate who the launching state will be. That does not mean that the Netherlands does not see itself as the responsible state, and if that activity falls under the scope of the Space Activities Act, it will be licensed as such. And if the Netherlands registers this object, it will also maintain jurisdiction and control. But this is more to establish the position of the Netherlands as the launching state that entails liability compared to a state where the launching of a space object is simply procured. Looking into the future, there are discussions about reviewing, amending, perhaps complementing the regime. And the scope of the Space Activities Act could be expanded in the future. For example, the free licensing application may have a fee if there are several operators that would require authorization under the Space Activities Act. The Netherlands has signed the Artemis Accords, although it is a member of all 5 space treaties, including the Moon Agreement. There is a long-term space strategy published by the Netherlands Space Office in 2023. I referred previously to the authorizing entity in the Netherlands that falls under the Ministry of Economic Affairs. The Netherlands Space Office is the unofficial, although official, Dutch space agency, and it implements the space policy as this is determined by the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Some of the issues that may be amended in the Space Act may, of course, follow international developments, especially when it comes to sustainability, potential cybersecurity requirements for the space sector, if these come from the European or the international regime, and of course, a potential EU space law that may create rights or obligations for operators. With that, and with maybe 10 seconds more, I hope, I would like to conclude my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Jacques Rosenau from TÜVIT. One question related to cybersecurity. You mentioned here cybersecurity requirements as part of the space law, or is this part of the national transformation from the NIS2 into national law?
Mm-hmm. Both, because the technical requirements that an applicant has to meet, existing requirements, also involve the safety, including the cybersecurity safety of a space activity. But this is the description as it is required at the moment without elaborating on what cybersecurity and safety means in this regard. There may be a review forthcoming in the Dutch legal framework if we have more specific cybersecurity requirements coming from the NIS2 directive, the SARE directive, other developments, or from an EU space law. There is a cybersecurity requirement at the moment, not very specified. It's determined on a case-by-case basis depending on the activity of the applicant, and it may be evolved in the future if we have external requirements that have to be implemented into the national law.
It's the top of the hour. I would like to thank my panel. That concludes the first episode of our Space Law mini-series from Space Tech Expo 2024 in Bremen. Stay tuned for the episodes number 2 and 3. And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.